shaping everything we thought we understood about the ancient world. Somewhere beneath cold, dark, pressing water, there are streets, there are walls. There are doorways that once framed the lives of human beings who woke up every morning, went about their days, raised their children, built their temples, and looked out at a horizon that they believed would always be there waiting for them. And then one day, in a span of time that history has not yet been able to fully measure or explain, all of it disappeared beneath the sea. This is not mythology. This is not the stuff of ancient storytelling passed down through generations of poets and philosophers searching for meaning in metaphor. What we are talking about is real stone, real architecture, real evidence of human civilization sitting on the ocean floor, waiting for the modern world to find it, examine it, and finally begin asking the questions that this discovery demands. Because when you find a city beneath the ocean, you are not simply finding old buildings in an unusual location. You are finding proof that our understanding of ancient history has enormous gaps in it, that the civilizations we know from textbooks and museum displays represent only a fraction of what once existed, and that the sea has been keeping secrets for thousands of years that we are only now beginning to crack open. The discovery we are going to explore in this documentary is one that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community, a community that is generally cautious, methodical, and not easily shaken by new findings. These are people who have dedicated their lives to the slow, careful, painstaking work of recovering the past, and when something genuinely surprises them, when something comes out of the deep water and forces them to reconsider their assumptions, the rest of the world needs to pay attention. Because what sits beneath those waves is not just rubble. It is a fully articulated ancient city, with recognizable structures, organized street grids, preserved architectural features, and evidence of sophisticated human occupation stretching back to a period of history that challenges our established timelines and demands a complete reassessment of how advanced ancient coastal civilizations truly were. We will spend the next 2 hours going deep into this story, and we mean that both literally and figuratively. We will follow the discovery from its first glimmers of possibility to the full-scale underwater excavations that revealed its breathtaking scope. We will explore what the city looked like, how it was built, who might have lived there, and what the ancient Greek world tells us about places like this. We will wrestle with the competing theories about how an entire city ends up beneath the ocean, from violent seismic catastrophes to the slow, relentless climb of rising sea levels that drowned coastal settlements across thousands of years of geological time. We will look at what this discovery means for our understanding of ancient Greek civilization specifically, and we will confront the question that always lurks at the edges of conversations like this one, the ancient legend of Atlantis, and whether a real sunken city changes anything about how we interpret that most famous of all lost city stories. By the time we reach the end of this journey, you will see the ancient world differently. You will look at the ocean differently. And you will understand that beneath the surface of the sea lies not just water and darkness, but an archive of human experience so vast and so rich that generations of future archaeologists will spend their entire careers exploring it and still not reach the end of what it contains. The ancient world was bigger than we knew. The civilizations that shaped human history were more widespread, more sophisticated, and more numerous have told us. And the ocean has been quietly preserving their remains, waiting for the moment when human technology and human curiosity finally became powerful enough to find them. That moment has arrived. To truly understand why the discovery of a submerged ancient city is so profoundly significant, you have to first understand the world that these ancient people lived in, the world that existed before the ocean claimed their streets and their temples and their homes. You have to go back in time, not just a few centuries, but thousands of years, to a period when the coastlines of the Mediterranean and Aegean looked dramatically different from the maps we use today, when sea levels were not fixed and stable, but were actively changing in ways that would have been perceptible within the span of individual human lifetimes. The story begins long before any Greek city was built, long before any Greek sailor ever pushed a wooden hull out into Aegean waters. It begins at the end of the last great ice age, a period that geologists call the late Pleistocene, when enormous sheets of ice covered vast portions of the northern hemisphere and locked up so much of the planet's water in frozen form that global sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels in the Mediterranean region were somewhere between 100 and 140 meters lower than they are now. That is a staggering difference. It means that what is today the bottom of shallow coastal waters, what is today the seabed that divers explore and that fishing nets scrape across, was once dry land, inhabited land, land where ancient people walked, hunted, farmed, and built their lives. As the ice began to melt, the sea began to rise. This was not a sudden process. It happened over thousands of years, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, punctuated by occasional dramatic surges when particularly large sections of ice sheets collapsed into the ocean. But over the broad sweep of geological time, the pattern was consistent and inexorable. The sea was rising. Coastlines that had been dry for millennia were gradually being submerged. Coastal communities that had been built at the water's edge were finding themselves increasingly vulnerable to the encroaching waves. By the time we reached the period that most concerns us, the period of classical and pre-classical Greek civilization, roughly from around 3,000 to 500 years before the Common Era, global sea levels had risen significantly from their Ice Age lows, but they had not yet reached the precise configuration they occupy today. The Eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean Sea, the Ionian Coast, all of these regions were still experiencing the long tail of post-glacial sea level rise, and the people who built their cities along these shores were doing so in a landscape that was, in a geological sense, still in flux. This is crucial context for everything that follows. When we find an ancient Greek city beneath the water, we are not necessarily looking at a city that was destroyed by some single dramatic catastrophic event. We may be looking at a city that was simply caught in the slow, centuries-long process of coastal inundation, a process that would have proceeded gradually enough for some inhabitants to adapt and move inland, but dramatically enough over the span of generations to eventually leave an entire urban settlement sitting on what had become the floor of the sea. But the story is more complicated and more interesting than simple sea level rise, because the Eastern Mediterranean is also one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The tectonic forces that shape the dramatic landscape of Greece, the rugged mountains, the deep valleys, the countless islands scattered across the Aegean like the broken pieces of a shattered coast, these same forces are constantly at work beneath the surface, building pressure and releasing it in earthquakes that can be devastating in their intensity. And when an earthquake strikes coastal terrain, the consequences can include not just the collapse of buildings, but the sudden, violent subsidence of large sections of land, areas that were above sea level one moment finding themselves several meters below it the next, inundated almost instantly by the rushing water of the sea. So when archaeologists look at a submerged ancient city, they are immediately confronted with two very different possible explanations that have very different implications for what the discovery tells us. Was this a city slowly swallowed by gradually rising seas over centuries? Or was it a city that experienced a sudden catastrophic event, an earthquake, a tsunami, a rapid subsidence of the coastal shelf on which it was built, that plunged it beneath the waves in a matter of hours or days? The physical evidence of the city itself, the way its buildings are arranged, the state of their preservation of collapsed walls and scattered artifacts, can tell us a great deal about which scenario is more likely. And as we will discover, the answer in the case of our submerged city is complex enough to challenge simple explanations and demand a nuanced understanding of how multiple forces can combine to produce a single extraordinary outcome. Let us begin to talk about the discovery itself, because before we can analyze and theorize, we need to understand what was found, where it was found, and how the finding came about. Underwater archaeological discoveries rarely happen the way they do in movies, with a single dramatic moment of revelation in which a diver suddenly swims around a corner and comes face to face with a perfectly preserved ancient city. The reality is almost always more gradual, more methodical, and interesting because it intersection of human observation, scientific technology, and the accumulated knowledge of scholars who have been looking for exactly this kind of thing for decades. The discovery of this particular submerged city began, as many of the most important archaeological finds do, national archaeology, but with ordinary people and in the sea entirely unrest. Fishermen inadvertently pulling up their nets to find pottery shards, bronze object, and the occasional marble fragment tangled among their catch. Sponge divers exploring the seabed in search of their quarry have stumbled upon ancient wrecks and submerged ruins with a frequency that professional underwater archaeologists find simultaneously wonderful and slightly frustrating, because these informal discoveries often happen without any systematic documentation, and crucial contextual information is lost. In this case, it was a combination of local knowledge and modern technology that first pointed investigators toward the possibility that something significant was lying on the seafloor in this particular location. Local fishermen had long known that certain areas of the seafloor in this region had unusual characteristics, areas where their nets would catch unexpectedly, where the bottom had irregular features that did not match the smooth, sandy profiles of undisturbed seabed. These were the kinds of observations that fishermen passed down to their children and their grandchildren, knowledge embedded in the practical wisdom of people who have worked the same waters for generations. Something was down there. It had been down there long enough to become part of the informal geography of the sea as the local fishing community understood it. When researchers equipped with modern sonar technology began systematic surveys of the seafloor in this region, what they found confirmed and vastly exceeded what local knowledge had suggested. The sonar returns were extraordinary. Instead of the expected profiles of natural seabed formations, the instruments were detecting something that looked unmistakably organized. There were right angles where nature does not produce right angles. There were regular patterns, repetitive structural forms that spoke not of geological processes but of deliberate human construction. There were what appeared to be walls, streets, open spaces that might have been courtyards or plazas, and larger structures whose footprints suggested buildings of significant size and architectural ambition. The sonar images were remarkable enough to prompt immediate interest from the archaeological community, but sonar images, however detailed and compelling, are not the same as physical examination. The next step was to put divers in the water, to actually descend to the seafloor and see with human eyes what the instruments had detected. This transition from remote sensing to direct observation is always a critical moment in underwater archaeology, because it is the point at which the tantalizing outlines revealed by technology either resolve into genuine archaeological significance or turn out to be natural formations that merely happen to produce instrument readings suggesting something more. In this case, the divers found exactly what the sonar had implied they would find, and more. The seafloor in this area was covered with structures, real structures, clearly artificial, clearly the product of deliberate human construction rather than any natural geological process. There were walls built from dressed stone, stone that had been cut and shaped by human hands before being laid in courses that were still recognizable thousands of years after the original builders had walked away from their work. There were what appeared to be paved surfaces, the remains of floors or roadways, flat expanses of fitted stone that lay beneath the accumulated sediment of centuries, but were still visible in outline. There were column bases, those distinctively circular foundations that ancient Greek architecture used to support the colonnaded structures that were such a characteristic feature of Greek civic and religious life. and there was the scale of it. The divers moved through the submerged city, and the extent of it kept revealing itself, structure after structure, wall after wall, the accumulated physical evidence of what had clearly once been a substantial urban settlement. This was not a village or a small outpost. The spatial extent of the ruins, the diversity of their architectural forms, the evidence of multiple types of buildings serving multiple functions, all of this pointed toward a genuine urban center, a place where significant numbers of people had lived and worked and organized their collective existence according to the sophisticated civic principles that we associate with ancient Greek civilization. The depth of the ruins varied across the site. Some of the structures were sitting in relatively shallow water, close enough to the surface that recreational divers would be able to reach them with modest effort. Other parts of the site descended into deeper water, where the pressure and the darkness required more specialized equipment and more experienced divers to investigate properly. This variation in depth was itself informative, suggesting either that the site occupied sloping terrain that was already varying in elevation when it was inhabited, or that different parts of the city had subsided by different amounts over time, or some combination of both. Mapping this depth variation carefully would become one of the key tasks of the archaeological team as they began the systematic work of documenting what they had found. The work of documenting an underwater archaeological site is technically demanding in ways that have no equivalent in terrestrial archaeology. On land, an excavation team can work for hours at a stretch, move easily across their site, use conventional measuring tools and recording equipment, communicate verbally with colleagues, and take photographs in natural light with ordinary cameras. Underwater, none of these things are true. Divers are constrained by their air supply, by the physiological limitations that depth imposes on the human body, by the distorting effects of water on visual perception, by the challenges of communication, and by the difficulty of using tools and recording equipment while weighted, finned, masked, and fighting the constant gentle push and pull of underwater currents. Yet despite all of these challenges, underwater archaeologists have developed sophisticated methodologies for documenting submerged sites with remarkable precision and thoroughness. The use of photogrammetry, the technique of creating three-dimensional models from overlapping photographs, has revolutionized the documentation of underwater sites in recent years. By swimming systematic patterns across a site and capturing thousands of overlapping photographs, researchers can feed that imagery into specialized software that produces detailed three-dimensional models of the ruins, models that can be measured, analyzed, and shared with colleagues around the world without anyone needing to physically descend to the seafloor. These photogrammetric models of our submerged city revealed something that became immediately and centrally important to understanding what this place had been. The city had a clear, organized internal structure. This was not a random scattering of buildings that had grown up organically over centuries without any overarching plan. There was a street grid, a system of lanes and thoroughfares that divided the city into recognizable districts or neighborhoods. The streets had a consistent orientation, which in the context of ancient Greek urban planning is a significant detail, because it tells you something about the foundational principles on which the city was built and the cosmological or practical considerations that governed its layout. Greek urban planning, particularly in the cities founded during the great period of Greek colonization from roughly the 8th through the 5th centuries before the Common Era, often followed systematic principles associated with what ancient sources call the Hippodamian grid, named after Hippodamus of Miletus, who is credited in ancient texts with having rationalized city planning along orthogonal lines. The Hippodamian city was laid out on a regular grid of streets, with distinct zones set aside for public, private, and sacred functions, creating a rational spatial organization that reflected Greek ideas about the good city as an expression of ordered civic life. Whether or not the city we are examining actually follows Hippodamian principles, or whether it represents an earlier or alternative tradition of organized urban planning, is one of the questions that the archaeological investigation must answer. What the photogrammetric models showed was consistent with a planned urban settlement of significant sophistication. The streets were wide enough for wheeled vehicles and for the kind of bustling commercial and civic traffic that a functioning ancient city would generate. The city blocks defined by the street grid contain multiple buildings of varying sizes and apparent functions. Some of the larger structures showed evidence of having been public or civic buildings, their footprints and architectural features distinguishing them from the smaller, more densely packed structures that suggested residential use. And in one area of the site, where the ruins were better preserved than in others, the investigators could make out what appeared to be the remains of a substantial structure that might have been a temple or a major civic building, its foundations laid on a scale that spoke of institutional ambition and communal investment. The question of dating, of establishing when this city was built and when it was inhabited, is one of the most fundamental and also one of the most challenging problems in underwater archaeology. On a terrestrial site, archaeologists can use a wide range of dating techniques on materials that are relatively easy to access and sample. Carbon dating of organic materials, thermoluminescence dating of burned ceramics, dendrochronology of preserved wood, and stratigraphic analysis of soil layers all contribute to building a chronological framework for a site. Underwater, accessing materials for dating is more difficult. The preservation conditions are different and can affect the reliability of some techniques, and the stratigraphic relationship between artifacts and structures can be disturbed by underwater currents in ways that have no equivalent in terrestrial contexts. Nevertheless, the investigators working on our submerged city were able to gather enough material to begin constructing a chronological picture of the site, and what that picture revealed was both exciting and, in the broader context of ancient history, deeply significant. The artifacts recovered from the site, carefully documented in their positions before being retrieved, ranged from ceramics to metal objects to architectural ornaments, and the typological analysis of these objects, the technique of comparing their forms and styles to similar objects from other dated contexts, suggested a range of occupation spanning a remarkably long period. The earliest materials from the site appeared to date to a period well before what we typically think of as classical Greek civilization, pointing toward occupation that predated the great flowering of Greek culture in the 5th century before the Common Era by many centuries. This was not a city built during the golden age of Athens, the time of Pericles and Socrates and the Parthenon. This was a city that had its roots in a much earlier period, in the shadowy transitional era that bridges the Bronze Age civilizations of the Aegean, the Mycenaeans and the Minoans and their contemporaries, with the emerging Iron Age Greek world that would eventually produce classical civilization. This early dating immediately raised the stakes of the discovery considerably. Bronze Age Greek civilization is one of the most fascinating and least fully understood chapters in ancient history. The Mycenaean civilization, which flourished roughly between 1600 and 1100 before the Common Era, was a sophisticated palace-centered society that controlled significant territories, engaged in long-distance trade across the Mediterranean, and produced the warrior culture that Homer would later immortalize in the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Minoans of Crete, slightly earlier, were an even more mysterious civilization, one of the earliest truly urban cultures in the European world, responsible for elaborate palace complexes, a distinctive artistic tradition, and a writing system that was not deciphered until the mid-20th century. What happened to these Bronze Age civilizations is itself one of history's great mysteries. Around 1200 before the Common Era, in a period that scholars call the Late Bronze Age collapse, virtually all of the sophisticated palace-based civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean experienced catastrophic decline or complete collapse. The Mycenaean palace system fell apart. Significant urban centers were abandoned or destroyed. The population of the Aegean region declined dramatically. Trade networks that had connected Greece, Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant for centuries disintegrated. And Greece entered what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, a period of several centuries during which writing disappeared, monumental architecture ceased to be built, and the complex social organization of the Bronze Age gave way to much simpler, more dispersed forms of settlement. If our submerged city has its origins in the Bronze Age, and if it continued to be occupied through the transition period into the early Iron Age, it represents an extraordinary piece of evidence about how people in this region lived through one of history's most dramatic episodes of social and civilizational change. Was it one of the cities that collapsed during the late Bronze Age catastrophe, or did it somehow survive that collapse and continue into the subsequent period? The artifacts from the site suggest a continuity of occupation that is itself remarkable, evidence that this particular coastal community may have weathered storms that destroyed its contemporaries elsewhere in the Greek world. The later materials from the site, the ceramics and objects that date to what scholars call the Archaic and early Classical periods, roughly the 7th through 5th centuries before the Common Era, speak to a community that had endured and rebuilt, that had emerged from whatever disruptions the Bronze Age collapse had brought and continued to develop its urban life in the centuries that followed. The presence of distinctively archaic Greek ceramics, with their characteristic geometric and then increasingly figurative decorative styles, places this community firmly within the broader cultural world of early Greece, connected through trade and cultural exchange to the wider Greek network of cities and settlements that stretched across the Aegean and Mediterranean world. To truly appreciate what this submerged city represents, you need to understand the broader context of Greek coastal civilization and the extraordinary extent to which the sea shaped every aspect of Greek life and culture. Greece is, above everything else, a maritime civilization. The geography of the Greek world, that complex of peninsulas, islands, and indented coastlines that comprises the Aegean basin, makes the sea not an obstacle or a boundary but the fundamental medium of connection, commerce, and communication. Greek cities did not turn their backs on the sea. They faced it, embraced it, organized their economies around it, and built their identities in relation to it. The sea was the highway that connected Greek communities to each other and to the wider Mediterranean world. A merchant from an Aegean city could sail to Egypt, to the Black Sea coast, to southern France, to Spain, all within the span of a single sailing season. This maritime connectivity was the foundation of Greek commercial prosperity, because it meant that no Greek city was truly isolated, that every coastal settlement had access to a vast network of exchange through which raw materials, finished goods, ideas, artistic styles, and cultural influences could flow. The sea was also the medium through which Greek civilization spread itself across the Mediterranean in the great colonial movement of the Archaic period, when Greek city-states established daughter colonies at key points around the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts, creating a network of Greek-speaking, Greek-practicing communities that eventually stretched from the eastern coast of the Black Sea all the way to the Atlantic coast of what is now Spain. For a civilization this thoroughly oriented toward the sea, coastal settlements were not peripheral or vulnerable locations to be occupied only when no better alternative was available. They were prime real estate, the most desirable locations for cities and towns because they combined the practical advantages of access to the sea with whatever productive agricultural land existed in the coastal hinterland. The great cities of the ancient Greek world were overwhelmingly coastal. Athens, Corinth, Miletus, Ephesus, Syracuse, Alexandria, Carthage, all of these major centers of ancient civilization sat at or very near the water's edge, because that was where power, prosperity, and connectivity were most easily achieved. This maritime orientation also meant that Greek civilization accumulated an extraordinarily detailed practical knowledge of the sea, its depths and shallows, its currents and winds, its seasonal patterns, and its dangers. Greek sailors and fishermen knew these waters intimately in the way that only people whose lives depend on that knowledge can know them. They knew which capes were dangerous in particular wind conditions, which channels were navigable at what drafts, where the good anchorages were, and where the treacherous shoals lay hidden. And they knew in the practical, embodied way of people who have worked the sea for generations, that the relationship between sea and land was not fixed, that in some places the water was advancing and in other places it was retreating, that coastlines that their grandfathers had known looked subtly different from the coastlines they themselves navigated. This knowledge was embedded in Greek mythology and geography in ways that are often overlooked. Ancient Greek sources contain numerous references to places that had once been dry land or coastal settlements that were now beneath the water, references that have sometimes been dismissed as purely mythological, but that modern archaeological investigation is increasingly revealing as potentially accurate descriptions of real events and real places. The ancient Greeks were not naive about the dynamic relationship between sea and land. They had a sophisticated tradition of thought about geological processes, including the possibility of land subsiding and being swallowed by the sea, that was rooted in direct observation of real phenomena in their own world. This brings us to a figure whose writings have been at the center of every serious conversation about sunken cities and lost civilizations for more than 2,000 years. His name was Plato, and he was one of the greatest philosophers ancient Greece produced. And in two of his dialogues, works known as the Timaeus and the Critias, he told a story about a great civilization that had existed long ago, a civilization of extraordinary power and sophistication that had ruled a vast oceanic empire, and that had been swallowed by the sea in a single terrible day and night of catastrophic destruction. He called this civilization Atlantis. The Atlantis question is impossible to avoid in any serious discussion of submerged ancient cities, not because Plato's account is literally accurate, but because it has so thoroughly shaped the cultural framework through which people think about and interpret underwater discoveries. When a submerged city is found anywhere in the Mediterranean, the ancient Near East, or the Atlantic, the question immediately arises, could this be Atlantis? And while serious archaeologists and historians approach this question with considerable skepticism, it is worth engaging with it carefully rather than dismissing it, because Plato's Atlantis story, even if it is not a literal description of a real place, contains elements that are clearly rooted in real knowledge about the ancient world. Plato places his account of Atlantis in the mouth of characters who claim to be reporting an ancient tradition preserved by Egyptian priests and passed down to the Athenian statesman Solon. According to this account, Atlantis was a powerful maritime civilization that existed approximately 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would place it at roughly 9600 before the Common Era, at the very beginning of the post-glacial period when sea levels were rising rapidly. This civilization allegedly controlled a vast territory centered on a large island in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, and had attempted to conquer the ancient Mediterranean world before being defeated by the primitive ancestors of the Athenians. Following this defeat, Atlantis was destroyed and sunk into the ocean by divine intervention. The scholarly consensus has long been that Plato invented the story of Atlantis as a philosophical device, a way of exploring ideas about the corruption of civilization, the hubris of imperial ambition, and the fragility of human achievements in the face of divine judgment. This reading is supported by the way the Atlantis story functions within the dialogues that contain it, where it serves specific philosophical purposes rather than simply being reported as historical fact. Plato was a sophisticated literary artist as well as a philosopher, and he was perfectly capable of inventing a narrative tradition to make a philosophical point. But the Atlantis story contains elements that suggest real knowledge of real events, elements that Plato either invented with remarkable geological prescience or that he derived from actual traditions recording actual occurrences in the ancient past. The description of a civilization destroyed by catastrophic subsidence and flooding corresponds to real geological processes that did actually occur in the post-glacial Mediterranean world. The description of a powerful maritime civilization controlling a network of territories corresponds to what we now know about Bronze Age Aegean civilizations like the Minoans and Mycenaeans. And the time frame, while literally impossible to reconcile with any known civilization, might represent a telescoping or confusion of timelines that is common in oral traditions that attempt to preserve memories of events from the distant past. The most interesting scholarly hypothesis about the relationship between Plato's Atlantis and real historical events is the one that locates the kernel of truth in the story not in a sunken Atlantic island empire, but in the destruction of the Minoan civilization of Crete and its Aegean island settlements, particularly the catastrophic eruption of the Thera volcano, known today as Santorini, which occurred around 1600 before the Common Era. The Thera eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in human history, expelling enormous quantities of ash and pumice into the atmosphere, generating massive tsunamis that devastated coastal settlements across the eastern Mediterranean and causing the partial collapse of the volcanic island itself, sinking a significant portion of what had been inhabited Minoan territory beneath the sea. The parallels between the Thera catastrophe and Plato's Atlantis story are suggestive. A powerful civilization located on an island in the sea, destroyed by a combination of volcanic activity and marine inundation. A disaster of such scale that it became embedded in cultural memory and eventually found its way, transformed and mythologized through generations of oral transmission, into the account that Plato recorded. Whether you find this hypothesis convincing or not, it illustrates the broader point that the mythological traditions of ancient cultures often preserve, in distorted and embellished form, genuine memories of real catastrophic events that actually occurred. And this is directly relevant to our submerged city, because the traditions that surrounded the discovery, the local knowledge that first pointed investigators toward the site, included references to ancient stories about a coastal city that had been lost to the sea. These were not Atlantis stories, not tales of mythological grandeur and divine punishment. They were more modest, more specific, more local in character. They described a real place with a real name, a place that people in the region had been dimly aware of for generations, a place that occupied an uncertain zone between history and legend because the physical evidence of its existence was hidden beneath the water where ordinary people could not see it. The discovery of the submerged city transformed that uncertain tradition into confirmed historical reality. The stories had been right. There was a city there. It had gone beneath the sea. And now, for the first time in thousands of years, human beings were going down to look at it. Let us get back to the physical reality of the site and what the archaeological investigation was revealing about how it was built and what it looked like when it was a living city, because one of the most striking aspects of this discovery is the quality of the preservation. Underwater sites are often assumed to be better preserved than terrestrial ones, and in some respects this is true. Stone structures that have been sealed beneath marine sediment are protected from the weathering processes that erode and eventually destroy exposed buildings on land. But underwater sites also have their own preservation challenges, from the biological organisms that attack organic materials and certain types of stone, to the physical forces of waves and currents that can disturb and scatter artifacts and architectural elements. In the case of this particular site, the preservation is extraordinary by any standard. The marine sediment that covered much of the site over the millennia had acted as a protective blanket, sealing the structures beneath it and shielding them from the most destructive biological and physical processes. Where the sediment had been carefully removed by the archaeological team using water jets and suction devices, the underlying stone was revealed in a state of preservation that astonished the investigators. Carved surfaces that had been protected by the sediment were still sharp and clear. Building stones that had been sealed within collapsed wall rubble were found with their original surfaces largely intact. And in several locations, the team discovered features whose preservation went beyond what anyone had initially dared hope for. In one area of the site, excavators clearing sediment from a partially collapsed structure made a discovery that immediately became one of the defining moments of the entire investigation. Beneath a layer of collapsed roofing material, sealed by the implosion of the building's upper story and then buried by centuries of marine sediment, they found what appeared to be a mosaic floor. Mosaic floors are one of the characteristic art forms of the ancient Greek and later Roman world, created by pressing small pieces of colored stone or glass into a wet plaster or mortar bed to create decorative designs and pictorial scenes. The existence of mosaic floors is generally associated with significant prosperity because producing them required skilled craftsmen and access to materials of different colors from various sources. A mosaic floor in a submerged ancient city was therefore not just an aesthetically exciting find. It was evidence of the economic sophistication and cultural connection of the community that had produced it. The mosaic that was revealed as the sediment was painstakingly cleared away depicted a series of geometric patterns framing what appeared to be a figural scene, though the damage to the central portion of the floor meant that the full image could not be recovered. The geometric border patterns, however, were sufficiently preserved to allow stylistic analysis, and they were consistent with decorative traditions that can be dated to a specific period in Greek artistic development, providing one of the most reliable chronological anchors for the site. The patterns were confident and sophisticated, executed by craftsmen who clearly had extensive experience with this type of work, and they spoke of a community that was fully integrated into the broader Greek cultural world rather than a provincial outpost on the margins of that world. The architectural investigation of the larger structures in the site revealed even more about the sophistication of the city's builders and inhabitants. The temple or major civic building that had been identified in the earlier survey proved, on closer examination, to be a structure of remarkable ambition. Its foundations were laid in a manner consistent with the most demanding standards of ancient Greek temple construction, with large, carefully fitted blocks of local stone forming a platform on which the walls and columns had been raised. The column bases that survived gave the investigators the ability to calculate the probable spacing and diameter of the columns, and from that to estimate the height and roofline of the building. What emerged from these calculations was a structure that, when it was standing, would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the architecture of classical Greece, a columned building of significant size, probably serving as a religious sanctuary, that would have dominated its surroundings and been visible from a considerable distance at sea. This visibility from the sea is not an incidental point. In the ancient Mediterranean world, temples and major civic buildings were often deliberately positioned not just for functional reasons but for visual impact, both on their own communities and on approaching seafarers. A prominent temple on a headland or a hilltop was a landmark as well as a place of worship, a beacon that announced the presence of civilization to anyone approaching by water, and that served the practical navigational purpose of helping sailors identify their position along an otherwise featureless coastline. A city with a temple that was clearly visible from the sea was a city that understood its relationship to maritime commerce and wanted to signal its presence and its prosperity to the world. As the investigation of the submerged city deepened and the amount of data recovered from the site grew, The team of researchers working on the project began the painstaking process of integrating all of this physical evidence into a coherent picture of what the city had been, how it had functioned, and who had lived in it. This is always the most intellectually demanding phase of any archaeological project, the movement from raw data, measurements, photographs, artifact descriptions, and stratigraphic observations to historical interpretation, the attempt to use physical evidence to reconstruct the human reality of a place that no longer exists in its original form. What emerged from this interpretive process was a portrait of a community that was in many ways typical of the ancient Greek world, and in other ways distinctive in ways that reflected its particular coastal location and the specific historical circumstances of the region in which it was situated. Let us try to reconstruct, as fully as the evidence allows, what this city looked like when it was a living place. Approaching the city from the sea, as the vast majority of its visitors and much of its trade would have done in antiquity, the first thing you would have seen was the architectural profile of the settlement against the backdrop of the coastal landscape. Assuming the city was situated in the kind of location typical for Greek coastal towns, it would have occupied a spot where natural geography provided both practical advantages and aesthetic drama. A protected harbor, natural or artificially improved, would have offered safe anchorage for the fishing boats and trading vessels that were the arteries of the city's economic life. Behind the harbor, the city would have climbed the coastal terrain, its buildings arranged according to the natural topography and the demands of the street plan, with the most important structures elevated above the rest on whatever high ground the site offered. The harbor itself would have been a busy, noisy, intensely human place. Ancient harbors were the commercial hearts of coastal cities, the point of contact between the city and the wider world, where goods arrived and departed, where travelers and merchants came ashore, where the fishing fleet launched and returned with its catch. Archaeological evidence from Greek harbor sites generally points to an infrastructure of stone quays and jetties, warehouses for storing goods, and the market facilities where the produce of the sea and the products of long-distance trade were bought and sold. Whether our submerged city had all of these features is something the archaeological investigation is still working to establish, because the harbor area is one of the more complex and difficult parts of the site to excavate given the depth of the accumulated sediment and the technical challenges of working in what would have been the most dynamically active zone of the ancient waterfront. Moving inland from the harbor, you would have entered the commercial and civic heart of the city. Greek cities typically organized their public life around an agora, an open public space that served simultaneously as marketplace, meeting place, and the stage on which civic and political life was performed. The agora was where citizens gathered to hear public announcements, to debate political questions, to conduct business, to socialize, and to participate in the religious festivals and civic ceremonies that structured the communal life of the ancient Greek city. Identifying the agora in a submerged site is both important and challenging, because it was by definition an open space, and open spaces leave less obvious physical traces than the buildings that surround them. But the spatial organization of the street grid and the distribution of surrounding structures can often allow archaeologists to identify the location of the agora, even when direct evidence of the open space itself is limited. In our submerged city, the investigators believe they have identified a candidate location for the agora based on exactly this kind of indirect reasoning. There is a zone within the site where the building density is notably lower than in surrounding areas, a space defined by streets on at least two sides and bounded by what appear to be public or commercial structures. The largest of these surrounding structures, located on what would have been the north side of the space, shows architectural features consistent with a stoa, the covered colonnade that ancient Greek cities typically placed along one or more sides of their agoras to provide shaded space for commerce and civic gatherings. Stoas are architecturally distinctive, characterized by long, low profiles and regular column spacing, and while the one in our submerged city is too damaged for complete reconstruction, enough remains to confirm the identification with reasonable confidence. Around the probable agora and along the main streets of the city, the evidence for commercial and artisanal activity is abundant. Workshops identifiable by the concentrations of manufacturing debris found in their vicinity suggest a city with an active craft production sector. There is evidence for metalworking, for pottery production, and possibly for the kind of specialized craft production, fine textiles, carved objects, luxury goods, that would have required skilled craftsmen and generated goods valuable enough to justify the costs of long-distance trade. The distribution of pottery from different production centers, some local and some clearly imported from elsewhere in the Greek world, tells a story of a community connected by commercial networks to a wide geography of production and exchange. The residential quarters of the city, where the bulk of the population lived out their daily lives, are among the most informative parts of the site from a social and historical perspective. Greek domestic architecture of the classical and pre-classical periods followed a relatively consistent set of principles, centered on the concept of the courtyard house, an inward-facing residential structure organized around a central open courtyard that provided light, air, and private outdoor space to the family within. The courtyard house was well adapted to the Mediterranean climate, where hot summers made shade and ventilation critical concerns, and where the separation of private domestic space from the public world of the street and the agora was an important social and cultural value. The houses in our submerged city conform to this general pattern, though with local variations that reflect the specific social and economic conditions of this particular community. The smallest houses are modest structures, their room arrangements suggesting the limited space of families without significant resources, but with sufficient means to maintain a permanent stone-built residence rather than the more temporary structures that the very poor might inhabit. The larger houses are more elaborate, their courtyard arrangements more spacious, their construction more careful, and the quality of their finishing materials higher. The distribution of these different types across the city's neighborhoods is itself revealing, suggesting a social geography in which wealth and status were not randomly distributed, but concentrated in particular areas of the city that had advantages of proximity to the harbor or the civic center. In the most elaborately appointed of the residential structures, the investigators found evidence of decorative programs that went beyond the practical necessities of domestic life and pointed toward the aesthetic aspirations of families with means and cultural ambition. Beyond the mosaic floor already mentioned, there are traces of wall plaster that preserve faint remnants of painted decoration, the kind of colorful fresco painting that was a standard feature of prosperous Greek domestic interiors. The colors that survive, principally reds, blacks, and the characteristic terracotta tones of Greek decorative painting, speak of rooms that were once vivid and warm, spaces designed not just for habitation, but for the expression of cultural identity and social status. Among the artifacts recovered from the residential areas of the city, some of the most informative are the ceramic vessels that represent the everyday material culture of the inhabitants. Greek pottery is one of the most thoroughly studied artifact categories in ancient history, and the typological sequences that scholars have developed allow the forms and styles of vessels to be dated with considerable precision and to be assigned to particular regional production traditions. The pottery from our submerged city is a mixture of locally produced wares and imported pieces, with the imported ceramics coming from some of the most prominent production centers in the Greek world. The presence of high-quality imported pottery in the residential context is significant because it indicates that ordinary households in this city had access to the products of Greek commercial networks, that they were part of the broader economic world of ancient Greece rather than isolated from it. Particularly striking is the presence of ceramic vessels associated with the drinking of wine, an activity of enormous social and cultural significance in the ancient Greek world. The symposium, the formal drinking party that was one of the central institutions of Greek male social life, required a specific set of ceramic vessels: the crater for mixing wine with water, the amphora for storing the wine, the kylix from which it was drunk, and a variety of serving vessels. The presence of symposium ware in the residential contexts of our submerged city tells us that the social practices of the broader Greek world, including the elaborate ritual of the symposium with its complex rules of etiquette and its cultural significance as a space for intellectual and artistic performance, were part of the cultural life of this coastal community. These were people who participated fully in the social and cultural world of ancient Greece, not provincial outsiders looking in from the margins. The religious life of the city is one of the aspects most thoroughly reflected in the physical remains of the site, because Greek religion expressed itself so powerfully in architecture and material culture. We have already discussed the large temple or civic building that appears to have been one of the most prominent structures in the city. But the evidence for religious practice is not limited to this single major structure. Scattered across the site are smaller shrines, votive deposits, and cult installations that speak of a religious life that permeated every aspect of the city's existence rather than being confined to designated sacred spaces. Greek religion was fundamentally local and polytheistic, meaning that while all Greeks shared a common pantheon of Olympian deities headed by Zeus, and including Athena, Apollo, Poseidon, Demeter, and the rest, the specific cult practices of individual cities showed enormous variation. Each city had its own patron deity or deities, its own festival calendar, its own specific traditions of ritual practice that were inherited from the founding of the community and modified over time in response to local circumstances and historical events. Understanding which deities were particularly important in our submerged city requires examining the votive deposits, the objects that were deliberately dedicated to the gods as offerings, because the types of offerings and the iconography of any associated religious artwork or inscriptions can reveal which divine powers the community was most urgently soliciting. The votive deposits recovered from the site are extraordinarily informative in this regard. Among the offerings dedicated at what appears to have been one of the smaller shrine locations, the investigators found a concentration of small terracotta figurines, the mass-produced devotional objects that were among the most common forms of religious offering in the ancient Greek world. These figurines represent a range of divine and semi-divine figures, and the most numerous among them depict a female figure that can be identified on the basis of her attributes and iconography as either Aphrodite or one of the marine deities, goddesses associated with the sea and with the powers that govern the waters on which this coastal community so thoroughly depended. The prominence of marine religious iconography in the votive deposits is not surprising for a coastal city, but it is significant. It tells us that the community organized a significant portion of its religious life around the powers that govern the sea, which is exactly what you would expect from people whose livelihoods, whose safety, and whose connection to the wider world all depended on the mood and favor of those powers. Greek fishermen and sailors were deeply religious people, not necessarily in a philosophical sense, but in the practical, urgent sense of people who regularly put themselves in situations where the difference between life and death was a shift in the wind or a change in the current, and who therefore had very strong reasons to cultivate good relationships with whatever powers governed such things. There is also evidence at the site for the worship of deities associated with the protection of the city as a community, the boundary marking and guardian functions that Greek religion assigned to certain divine figures. These included Hephaestus as patron of craftsmen and fire, Hermes as protector of travelers and commerce, and the civic goddess Athena, whose worship was widespread across the Greek world in her role as guardian of cities and patron of the arts of civilization. The presence of a substantial temple structure that might be dedicated to such a civic deity would be consistent with the city's apparent sophistication and its sense of itself as a full participant in the community of Greek urban civilization. One of the most fascinating and ultimately most important questions that the investigation of this submerged city raises is the question of its relationship to the wider political world of ancient Greece. Greek cities in antiquity did not exist in isolation. They were embedded in complex webs of political, military, and economic relationships with other cities and with the larger political powers that periodically dominated the Greek world. Understanding where our submerged city fit in these networks, who it was allied with or dependent upon, what political identity its inhabitants would have claimed, is essential for placing it in its proper historical context. The evidence for political relationships in the archaeological record is indirect but not absent. The presence of particular types of coins is one of the most informative indicators of political and economic relationships, because ancient Greek cities typically minted their own coinage, and the circulation of particular